So my goodness, it's really such a pleasure to have this beautiful full room tonight. I'm so glad that everybody's here. I'm going to say a word about what we're all missing tonight in just a minute. I think you know our guest and our speaker tonight, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky. He is, as you know, the dean of the Berkeley Law School. He was the founding dean of the Irvine Law School at UC Irvine. He has taught law at Duke and USC and many other places. He has written, I believe it's 15, or is it maybe now 16 books on the law, including one that was just released on Tuesday, which you can get a copy of, probably a signed copy of, on September 4th, is that right, at Chevalier's bookstore. And I understand that he quite literally wrote the book on constitutional law. And one of the things that has been just such a pleasure about preparing for this evening has been hearing from so many of you about having studied with him, having been in his classes, having read his books, having heard him teach around the country. It's really clear your impact on people and the affection that your students have for you. Yesterday, Dean Chemerinsky taught at Berkeley. He did an event in Oakland, and then he took a red eye to Chicago, where he moderated a panel, or was on a panel at the convention this morning, and then got on a plane in time to be back here with us. So thank you for making all those travel arrangements. And United Airlines, yes, your other home, I'm sure, at times. And of course, I know people are watching the convention and anxious to see how the convention goes tonight. And so I appreciate you being here, and I'm sure we'll all catch it later. But I especially appreciate you being here. I think maybe you could have been in the room, and it's really an honor to have you here. The last thing I'm going to say is that, by way of introduction, is that some of you know my father, Eli Chernow, who spent his career as a lawyer and a judge, and he has had a few opinions on legal matter over the years and other things. And my mom told me that every time a conversation came up about a Supreme Court opening, his instant response was they should call Erwin Chemerinsky. So that's high praise so in my book. Yes. So I am going to let you introduce yourself and tell us what you're here to talk about, but please join me in welcoming Dean Chemerinsky to Temple Israel. Oh, I'm sorry. I did have one more thing to say by way of introduction. Forgive me. Most importantly, he is the grandfather of Amy, Sarah, and Andrew. And please tell your son, Jeff, that we're a little mad at them for moving to Pasadena, but we'll probably forgive them, and I'll be happy to help them to connect with some amazing Jewish community out there. Thank you.
They all went to preschool
and they grew up here.
As did Jeff.
Yes, I heard that.
41,
yeah.
so.
That's amazing.
Thank you for the incredibly kind introduction and the very warm welcome. It's truly a great honor and pleasure to be with you. I'm a 71-year-old Jewish man. I've experienced some anti-Semitism in my life, but I've never seen the expression of anti-Semitism that there's been since last October 7th. Some of it is the words that have been spoken, and you've seen this from across the country. You might have seen, as I did, a sign that was held up at George Washington University that said the final solution. You might have heard Jewish students at many campuses being told, quote, go back to Poland. You might have seen a student leader at Columbia saying, death to the Zionists. I've heard expression of this at Berkeley. I do a town hall for the students every semester, and by coincidence, my town hall last year was on October 11th, and one of the students said to me, I feel unsafe here. And I said, what can we do to make you feel safe? She said, get rid of all of the Zionists in the law school. I heard that very much as, get rid of the Jews that are here. There's been harassment that's gone on. The encampments on campuses often led to Jewish students being harassed and went by, Jewish students being blocked from having access to parts of campus. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, a federal judge here in Los Angeles found that UCLA, by allowing the encampment, had blocked Jewish students from access and issued an injunction against it. It's unfortunately no secret what went on in my backyard on April 9th. A little bit of context. My wife and I do dinners for all of the entering students at the beginning of the school year. We've done this since I became a dean at Irvine in 2009. But the class that graduated in May of 2024 didn't have those dinners because they started in 2021 and there were COVID restrictions. And so the presidents of the third-year class asked if we would hold dinners for them. And the answer was, of course, yes. The week before the dinners, poster went up on every bulletin board in the law school, multiple copies on every bulletin board. It was put online. It had a caricature of me holding a bloody knife and fork with what appeared to be blood around my lips. And one of the chilling things that's occurred across the country is the trope of blood libel, one of the worst anti-Semitic tropes being repeated. In fact, a report just came out at Stanford that talks about how that trope was repeated on that campus. And the poster said, "No dinner with Zionist Chem." I'm sure they just said Chem because Chemerinsky wouldn't fit on their poster. It didn't criticize anything that I have said or done. All it did was say that the University of California should divest in Israel. As you might guess, the law school has nothing to do with the UC investments. The night of the dinner came, my wife and I greeted all of the students in front of our house. Then everyone goes to the back for dinner. And after everyone got their food and was sitting down, a student who was the head of Law Students Just Palestine, who was responsible for that flyer, took a microphone out of her backpack, went to the top of the steps, and began a very strong pro-Palestinian speech. My response was, "You can't disrupt this event, and you can't do this in my home. Please leave." She continued. My wife grabbed the microphone. A video was taken by one of the other students, and it quickly went viral. My wife and I received countless death threats in the days that followed. In fact, there were so many coming into the law school that we just stopped answering the phone in the dean's office. We received thousands of hate messages. And of course, this is just one incident at one home, one campus in the country. We're talking about so many more. What I find heartbreaking of what's gone on over the last almost year is at the interpersonal level among students. I hear so much from students of other students won't let them be part of a study group or won't be friends with them because they're Jewish, because they're from Israel. And of course, that's the hardest thing to deal with. We can have policies in the school, but we can't regulate interpersonal behavior. Well, it's in this context that you asked me to come talk about free speech on campus. And let me just make 4 quick points as we discuss this. And then I'm glad to take any questions from you and from others. The first, what has to be the starting point, is that all ideas and views can be expressed on a college campus, period. It doesn't matter how offensive the idea. It doesn't matter how objectionable the idea. The core of the First Amendment is that there's no ideas or views that are beyond the pale, so they can't be expressed. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the First Amendment applies only to public universities. Private universities don't have to comply with it, though in California there's a statute, the Leonard Law, that says that private universities cannot punish speech, that a public university can't because of the First Amendment. It's a California statute. Many college universities have faculty and student handbooks that promise to protect free speech, and that's a contract respect with faculty and students, but we're talking with regard to the First Amendment about public universities. Second, as everyone knows, free speech is not absolute. We're all familiar with the late Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes saying there's no right to falsely say fire in a crowded theater. There are a couple of exceptions to the First Amendment that are relevant to campuses. And what's so important with regard to these exceptions is that you've got to focus on how the court has defined the term, not how colloquially we use it. One of these is incitement of illegal activity. And the Supreme Court has made it very hard to prove it's incitement that's not safeguarded by the First Amendment. In order to be incitement, there has to be a likelihood of imminent illegal action, and the speech has to be directed at causing imminent illegal action. Today I got an email while I was on the plane from somebody who was at the event this morning. He said, "Isn't somebody on campus saying, 'Death to the Jews,' incitement?" I said, "It's objectionable, it's awful, but by itself, it doesn't show that there's an imminent likelihood of illegal activity." And the Supreme Court has emphasized imminence. So if it meets the test for incitement, it's not protected. Imagine a speaker on campus talking to an angry crowd, exhorts them to commit acts of vandalism and arson. That could be incitement. But an idea by itself, it all depends on the context. Also, true threats are not protected by the First Amendment. There's no First Amendment right to make somebody fear for his or her safety. Imagine a student is walking across campus and a group of students surround that student and say things that cause that student to fear for his or her safety. Even if no blows are struck, even if it's words, those responsible could be prosecuted, convicted, or held civilly liable. But one thing to note when you talk about the categories of unprotected speech is that generally hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. One of those frequent questions I get is, where's the line between free speech and hate speech? It's a false distinction in the United States. The Supreme Court time and again has made clear that even hateful expression is safeguarded. There's a case from 1992, R.A.V. versus City of St. Paul. It involves St. Paul ordinance that made it a crime to paint a swastika or burn a cross, vile symbols of hate, in a manner likely to anger, alarm, or cause resentment. 9-0, the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. In the early 1990s, over 360 colleges adopted hate speech codes. They were all well-intentioned, but everyone to come to court, without exception, was declared unconstitutional. Some of it was about the vagueness with which they defined hate speech, but a lot of it is that hate speech is vile, but it's still an idea, and all ideas are protected by the First Amendment. The third of my 4 points is to remember that colleges, universities can have time, place, and manner restrictions with regard to speech. So long as they're content neutral, they apply to all speech the same regardless of content, and so long as they leave adequate places for communication. And so college universities can have rules that say no demonstrations near classroom buildings while classes are in session. Colleges and universities have rules that say no demonstrations near dormitories at nighttime. Colleges and universities can have time, place, and manner restrictions that prevent encampments. One of the interesting things about the encampments that occurred across the country last spring is I think in every instance they violated campus rules. It wasn't a question of the First Amendment. Campus officials could have the encampments taken down. It was a question of, from a political and a pragmatic perspective, what did campus officials want to do? You might have seen that earlier this week, the president of the University of California, Michael Drake, issued policies. It's clear now no encampments will be allowed on any of the UC campuses. Also, there are clear time, place, manner restrictions. Also, they prevent people from wearing face coverings so as to hide their identity in a protest. There was an incident at Berkeley in February where a crowd kept a speaker from Israel from being able to go ahead with the plan for address. And Berkeley has been stymied in holding those responsible accountable because they were all wearing masks. And the South, a number of states have had anti-masking laws that go back to the Klan. And so that's what's the basis for this. But the key to remember is there can be time, place, manner restrictions with regard to speech. And I think we'll see campuses doing much more in that regard. Fourth and finally, as you may have read, there's the whole issue of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act relative to the First Amendment. Title VI says that recipients of federal funds cannot discriminate based on race or national origin. It's interpreted to include ethnicity. It's interpreted to include that there can't be discrimination against Jews or Muslims or those who are Israeli or those who are Palestinian. And the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education has given clear guidance that it interprets Title VI to mean that there cannot be a hostile environment on a campus for Jewish students, or for Muslim students. I think it's so important to constantly say, speaking out against anti-Semitism in no way lessens the condemnation of Islamophobia or racism or other forms of discrimination. But then the question comes up, well, if speech on campus creates a hostile environment, what about the First Amendment? So I have no doubt that some of what was said on college campuses does create a hostile environment for Jews. What about the First Amendment? And you mentioned I was on a panel this morning in Chicago. On that panel was Catherine Lehman, who's the Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights, the head of the Civil Rights, in which she said, answers this question. And she was forceful. She said, The First Amendment may mean that the students can't be punished for their speech. But what Title VI requires is that college universities not be deliberately indifferent when there's a hostile environment. That's the legal test, that there can't be deliberately indifferent. And what Assistant Secretary Lehman said is, there's so many things that college and universities can do without punishing the speech if it's protected by the First Amendment. College and university administrators can condemn the speech. Too much last year, college and university administrators were silent in the face of anti-Semitism. College universities can create training and education programs. They can provide support for students and all sorts, and much else. Let me just conclude here by telling one story, and then I'll finish. And it's directly on point. It's a case that I actually argued in a federal court of appeals. It was a case that was called Feminist Majority Foundation versus Hurley. It involves a public university in Virginia, Mary Washington University. There was a debate on campus as to whether to allow Greek life. And some women wrote an op-ed in the campus newspaper opposing it, saying when there's fraternities on campus, there's more violence against women. They then got targeted for the then social media platform Yik Yak over 600 vile messages, some threatening them with rape and murder. They went to campus officials, and the campus officials said, this is anonymous speech over social media. We can't do anything about it. The campus even put on its formal website, we are not responsible for anonymous speech over social media. And the campus did nothing. The women sued, and the campus said, this is First Amendment, it's speech. I represented them in the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit and won. And what the Fourth Circuit said was the campus was deliberately indifferent. And it gave a whole list of things that the campus could have done without punishing the speech that was protected by the First Amendment. And of course, the extent it was true threats, that's not protected by the First Amendment. But the key is campuses can't, as so often they did, do nothing. Now, I've tried to summarize for you what the current law is. I'm teaching First Amendment law this semester. It's a 4-unit class, and I think I've covered the whole semester in about 10 minutes. And you may not agree with what I've set out. Just described for you what the law is. I think that the underpinnings of the law with regard to the First Amendment is this notion that the only way my speech or your speech will be protected tomorrow is to safeguard the speech that we don't like today. That it's based on a tremendous distrust of government power. There's the sense that we are better off as a society letting all ideas and views be expressed than the government, the president, head of a university, tell us what ideas and views can be expressed. It's based on a faith, and I have that faith at least most of the time.
Thank you so much. Really beautiful articulation. Thank you. So important. You anticipated my first question a little bit, which I appreciate, and I just wonder if you might have a little bit more to say about how to what degree do you think that university officials and then ultimately Congress in hearings landed on the right place on these matters? Did we land in the right place, and are we headed to the right place on free speech?
The difficulty when you speak of university officials is there were so many across the country. Some I think reacted well, some I don't think reacted well. I felt strongly that there was all too much silence by university officials in the face of anti-Semitism. I did an op-ed in the LA Times, I think it was the end of October, that was all about my concern, the silence of university officials in the face of the blatant expression of anti-Semitism. And one of the points I made in that piece, and that I continue to make, is that anti-Semitism isn't being treated the same way that racism would be treated. When I think of the poster that was put up about me, if it had been about a black dean using a racist caricature, it would have been immediately condemned. If it had been a black dean and a black professor in a white supremacist student backyard, it would have been treated so differently than it's been treated to this point. So in that sense, I think we can't give a pass. Though, again, I don't want to generalize about all university officials. In terms of Congress, we're all familiar with what happened in the hearing on December 6th, where it was the 3 university presidents They were from Harvard and MIT and the University of Pennsylvania. I thought that hearing was a setup. I don't think it was about shedding light. I think the question from Representative Stefanik called for an emotional answer, and 4 hours into a hearing, it's not surprising that they fell on their training and gave a logical answer. One of the questions I most frequently got after that is, what would you have said if you were at the hearing? And I'll tell you something ironic. I was asked to be the Democratic witness at that hearing. All three university presidents were the Republican-called witnesses, and the Democratic staff called and said, we'd like to have a First Amendment professor, would you do it? And I had a conflict. I'm so glad I wasn't there that day. But what I would have said is, because the question was, does advocacy, expression of support for genocide against Jews violate campus policy? And the answer is, absolutely it violates campus policy. That the expression of support for genocide is inconsistent with all of our principles of community and everything that we stand for. And I would have spoken emotionally about how I have family members, both on my mother's and father's side, who died during the Holocaust, but also in a public university, no idea, even an offensive one, can be banned. And so in that sense, what Liz McGill said was right, that so much depends on context.
Thank you. We'll talk more about that. I know there are some questions. I'm going to ask a few more, and then I'll open it up. A few of us were gathered earlier, and you talked about the mood on campus and the mood amongst your students. And one of the things that you said was, it's so hot and so difficult right now that while there is space for the different ideas, it's not the time to bring together a panel of people with opposing ideas about Israel and Gaza. And I would invite you to tell us a little bit more about that. And I share that opinion even here in our own community. I don't know that we're ready for the deepest level of disagreement and conversation that I think we ultimately need to have. And I'm so sad about that. And I wonder if you see a way forward in this moment.
As I said, I think it's essential that the law school, the campus, universities generally, be places where all ideas and views can be expressed. And so I think it's completely appropriate for our students from Justice in Palestine to put forth their ideas, which right now are that Israel should not exist, should a Palestinian state. And it's completely appropriate for our Jewish students to put forth their views in terms of how important it is to be Israel. I think it's completely appropriate to criticize what Israel has done, or for others to defend what Israel has done. But the question is, how should we do it to be most constructive? It's hard for me to describe to you, unless you're on a campus, how tense it was last year, after October 7th and in the spring. Now, to be clear, it didn't involve all of the students in that way. For students, if there's both sides, they were deeply involved. We have students with families in Gaza and students with families in Israel. We have students who lost loved ones in the Middle East over the course of the last year. We have students for whom this is just basic to their identity. But then there's a whole lot of students for this isn't their issue, and they just went about being law students or college students as they would have anyway. But for those who care deeply, the question is, how do we best go forward as an educational institution? The year before last, we had some sessions where we brought in people for the same panel who had diametrically opposed views with regard to Israel and Palestine. Of course, there's not two positions, a whole range of positions on it. And we would have panels like that. I don't think we could do that yet. Now, the law students for Justice in Palestine bring in some very strong speakers for their viewpoint. We have the Diller Institute on Israel and Jewish Studies to bring in their speakers. And we want speakers from all of the viewpoints being in the law school. But to have them sitting on a stage in an audience from all of the different viewpoints, it's just too difficult at this moment in time.
The exchange might
That's
just
right.
be too painful. We're not really ready
this
to
moment.
hear each other. Yeah, I agree with that. If I can change topics briefly, I know we're here to talk about free speech and campus, but you write often about the Supreme Court. Would you tell us a little bit about your thoughts about the current court and the state of affairs in America?
This is the most conservative court that there's been since the 1930s, and by every measure it's so. And again, I'll tell a personal anecdote and then explain why it matters. About 25 years ago, I did the first edition of a constitutional law casebook that's used in many law schools. Last fall, I finished the 7th edition of that book. It was more different than the prior edition, or than any of the prior editions, than any book that I've done. It's dramatic how much constitutional law has changed in just the last few years. I mean, think about it. And just since 2022, the Supreme Court's overruled Roe versus Wade. The court has dramatically expanded gun rights. The court, for the first time, has said that a high school teacher has a First Amendment right to pray at a high school event in public. The Supreme Court has imposed so many new limits on the powers of federal agencies. The court's overruled 45 years of precedent that allowed college universities to use race as one factor in admission decisions to enhance diversity. The Supreme Court, for the first time, has said that a business has the right to violate anti-discrimination law when it's engaged in expressive activity. At the end of January of this year, Justice Sonia Sotomayor came and spoke at Berkeley. And when justices come to law schools, they always say, I don't want to give a speech. You can just interview me. I understand why. It's easier, and it's wonderful to get to have a conversation. And so my first question to her was, so much has happened in the court in the last 2 years. There's so much on the docket this term. How are you? And her response was, I'm exhausted. I think that if you want to understand this court, you should understand it is an expression of conservative Republican ideology at this moment in time. I think the Supreme Court's last decision of the term on July 1st in Trump versus United States, it held that the president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution when carrying out any constitutional or statutory power. We regard it as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. And the thing that I would raise just to think about, because none of us know the answer, I always regard the American people as maybe a little bit left of center on the whole or a little bit right of center on the whole. It's how you could have a country that could go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump as president. We have a Supreme Court that's very far to the right on that ideological spectrum. What will it mean in the long term? And these justices are going to be there a long time, to have a court that's so much more conservative than overall the American people.
I've watched videos also of you talking a little bit about the nature of the court and its reflection of America as being more polarized and more partisan than ever in its history. Wonder if you would share a few words about that.
One of the things that caused me to write the book that you referred to, No Democracy Lasts Forever, is seeing the loss of faith in government, the loss of confidence in all the branches of government, and the deep polarization in society. There's a lot of measures that political scientists use of polarization. One that I find interesting is you look at the approval of the president from his or her party compared to the approval from the opposing party. When Donald Trump was president, approval among Republicans was at 88%, and approval among Democrats is at 7%, the largest gap ever. The second largest gap is Joe Biden, and it's a gap of over 60%. Another measure of polarization that's used sometimes, people are asked, how would you feel about your child marrying somebody of another race? And thankfully, now very few people would object to it. But when people are asked now, how would you feel about your child marrying somebody of the other political persuasion? Over half say, I would have real problems with that. What's this polarization going to mean in the long term for the country? And what does it mean that we have a Supreme Court that I think is enhancing that political polarization, not lessening it?
It's a difficult note to end this part of the conversation on, but we'll find a way through to some optimism. I'm going to open it up. I know you have a lot of questions for Dean Chemerinsky. We'll start with you, Ben.
A year and a half ago, the president made a speech on the Mall. Did that speech meet the definition, your current definition of incitement?
You're, of course, referring to Donald Trump's speech on January 6th of 2021. And my answer, and I put this in writing, is yes. That I think when you look at the totality of the circumstances, and the law always looks at the totality of the circumstances, I believe that his speech was directed at causing imminent illegal activity, and I think there was a likelihood of imminent illegal activity. And it's a hard test to meet, but I think if you look at his words, and in the context of those words, I think it met the test for incitement.
First, Dean Chemerinsky, thank you very much for giving up your evening for us. Special
Honored,
night at the
delighted to be here.
convention. Thank you, thank you. Two quick questions. The first one is, going back to your statement about what campuses can do in the face of anti-Semitism. When students are threatened or inconvenienced or intimidated, statements of condemnation or training aren't really adequate. Are there more measures they can take without impinging on free speech that materially will make students safer? And the second question is your thoughts on President Biden's proposed Supreme Court reforms.
Sure. I believe that statements by university officials can make a difference and do matter. I completely agree with you. They're not sufficient, but I've been in institutions where I've seen that they make a difference, and also, if they're not there, silence can make a difference. I also think that policies can matter. Let me give an example of Berkeley. If you've been there, you know Sather Gate is what, as close you get to the main entrance of the Berkeley campus. The Students for Justice in Palestine blockaded Sather Gate. Now, you could still get through onto the campus by two doorways on each side, but the main gate area was blocked. The campus officials decided, for pragmatic reasons, better to let them block Sather Gate than to incur the wrath by taking it down. I have enormous respect for the chancellor and provost who made the decision, but I think it was the wrong decision. Because I think by letting this one group stand there every day, and though they weren't supposed to have amplification, they often had amplification, I think that sent the wrong message. I think we saw that the campuses that said, well, we'll just let the encampments be peacefully there, what often resulted. I mean, an irony that people tend to forget that is at UCLA, on the morning that the incident happened that night, there was an article in the New York Times saying that UCLA letting the encampment be there is a model of what's working well. And then it didn't work well. Irvine let the encampment be there until those in the encampment took over a building and caused great damage to it. I think that campus officials now will make the right choice of take down the encampment before it can grow. Have a policy that you can't let it be there at all. One of the things, and I alluded to only briefly, when there were the encampments, constantly heard of Jewish students being harassed and blocked from access. I heard it from my students at Berkeley. One of them was physically assaulted and going past the encampment, especially Jewish students who'd be wearing kippahs. I had Jewish students say to me, I won't wear my Star of David necklace anymore, she said, because I'm afraid that I'm going to get harassed when I walk across campus. Campus officials can't tolerate it. There has to be a zero tolerance for the harassment behavior. So there's much that can be done, but I think that for a variety of reasons, I'm glad to talk about, campus officials were unwilling to do that.
Oh, hi. Oh, thanks. Thanks for being here and answering some of these questions. It seems that you and the law school are fighting a losing battle with the other parts of the campus, because it seems as if, and rightly so, you're concentrating on what's legal and what's not legal, and the other 80% of the campus is concentrating on what's just and what's unjust. And it seems like the just and unjust folks are winning, because that's what allows a student to scream, all Zionists should be killed. And that seems to be what's being amplified at this time. I'm just wondering how you get back to integrating the idea of what's legal and what's just.
Both the law school and the campus are constantly focused on what's legal and illegal. I spent my Uber ride from LAX talking to our campus counsel, David Robinson, about issues. The campus is enormously concerned about it. And we in the law school, of course, are concerned about what's just and unjust. I would reframe what you say in terms of, really want to talk about what went on campus. So much that went on the Berkeley campus and campus across the country violated at least campus rules and sometimes the law. As I said, all of the encampments at every university violated rules that had already existed. Now the question is, why did the campuses choose to do nothing about the encampments? It wasn't about what was legal or illegal, because campuses lawfully could take down the encampments. It wasn't about what was just or unjust. I think there were several things, and it's complicated, that came together. One is the fear, understandably, of bringing police onto campuses. And so I think many campuses were very reluctant to do anything that involved a show of force. George Floyd wasn't that long ago. The memory of bringing police onto campuses in the late 1960s and early 70s is in the memory of many of us. So I think some of it was that. Some of it is, I think, let me just finish up real quick.
Sure.
Campus officials also were very afraid of the backlash. There are many faculty and students who side with the Students for Justice in Palestine and the encampment. And so efforts to try to take action would then risk censure resolutions and the like. And so in the face of that, campus officials chose to do nothing. And not all campus officials, as I said to the rabbi, you can't generalize, but many campus officials chose to do nothing. I don't think it was about what was legal or illegal. I don't think it was about just or unjust. I think it was what they thought was the pragmatic best approach.
I guess what I meant, I'm sorry, was that days after October 7th, people were standing up on Berkeley campus saying that what we'd seen was just resistance to Israel. And that seemed to be an idea that was embraced by a lot of the students and tolerated by the faculty.
Yes, I mean, the things that were said after October 7th at Berkeley Law School, at Berkeley, at campuses, celebrating Hamas, just chilling. Now, they had the First Amendment right to say those things, but campus officials were silent about it at that moment in time. And that's the place of, we can have lots of ideological discussions about what Middle East policy should be. But what Hamas did was terrorism of the worst sort. And yet, campus officials, for ever complex reasons, didn't speak out against those statements.
Maybe an issue of managing a crisis and leadership more than a particular legal issue or justice issue.
And they wanted to seem neutral, and they were afraid that if they condemned those students, it wouldn't seem neutral, and they would get criticized. And so they didn't say anything.
I'll take one question up here, and then we'll move to the back. Go ahead, Holly.
Oh, thank you. I understand everything in that last exchange that you did, but when the Jewish students were prevented from going to their classes, physically prevented here at UCLA, and I know because I was there on that very big Sunday that Stan with us we had a rally. And for one thing, we were made, when we entered to attend that rally, we were made to walk all the way around the long way around the campus, up a very steep hill, so we wouldn't disturb the Palestinian supporters and bother them. So there was a lot of giving in to the pro-Hamas supporters. And the thing that I think pained us so much was there didn't seem to be any thought or care to the Jewish students who were prevented from going to classes, prevented from going into a building, and they even canceled the commencement. So I'm just curious, what is the possible explanation or logic that you can share with us?
And to be clear, that violated both the law and any notion of justice, to go back to the prior question. Is a federal judge recently ruled in Los Angeles that blocking access for Jewish students violated Title VI, and of course, it's just unjust to have that happen. Then you get to the question of why did campus officials not take action about it? And I think this goes to what I was saying to the prior question. I think some of it was reluctance to use law enforcement, and we can talk about why that happened. I think some of it was a fear that if the campus officials did something, they would face a large backlash from some of the faculty and some of the students. I'm not excusing what they did. You asked me, why do I think that they didn't take action? And I think some of it was that they felt if they could manage it by doing nothing, it would be better than doing something that would engender a response. And my hope is that campus officials have learned from that that doesn't work. It's not legal and it's not just.
Two things. One, I'm having a genuinely hard time understanding the intersection between this concept of the hostile work environment analogy to the university and free speech. I understand and I agree with you, for example, that to make an easy metaphor or analogy, I should say, if one says Hitler had the right idea, absolutely protected, now let's finish the job, maybe not. And that's a good, simple dichotomy to understand. What I don't understand and what I'm troubled by, because I don't know what's going to happen, is as an alumnus of two Ivy League institutions who speak, I speak to the sort of leaders of these institutions, and I'm troubled and confused. What I'm hearing right now is that at the very top of the sort of trustee level of these places, they say, we've been burned badly the past year, and our new solution is we're just not going to be in the business of taking positions. We're not going to say on October 8th that we condemn Hamas. We're not going to say that we condemn Netanyahu. We're just not going to be in the business of doing anything outside of our core educational mission because everybody just gets mad at us and everybody gets upset. So I hear this from them, and this is coming from sort of the presidents of these universities. So my question...
Synagogues are deciding the same thing.
Fair
I'm
enough.
Just kidding.
No, maybe, but I
it's
think...
tempting, yeah.
But my question then becomes, I think, is it a feature or a bug of the intersection between sort of hostile work environment, jurisprudence and logic and law, and First Amendment law to say, what does a school do? Because in your example you just had, you said, well, a school should say, you know, maybe, if there were banners festooned saying Hitler had the right idea, it might be, from a Title VI standpoint, incumbent upon a university under your framework to say, well, that's very troubling and we don't support that. But then we get into at least two problems. One is, can you compel a university to speak under the unconstitutional conditions aspect of the First Amendment? And two, what obligations do they have to say anything at all when saying something necessarily goes from procedural to substantive in that area? So how can we sort this out? I feel like we're in a knot right now.
Sure. There's so much in that question. Let me just try to deal with a part of it. The key to remember is that under Title VI, the campus can't be deliberately indifferent. And then the question is, what is enough for the campus to do to avoid people saying that they were deliberately indifferent under the circumstances? There are instances where the speech is unprotected by the First Amendment, and then what the campus should do is prohibit and punish the speech. Much of what we find offensive is protected by the First Amendment. Then we can go to a long list of things that campus officials can do. And last May, Assistant Secretary Lehman wrote a Dear Colleague letter to all of the college universities where she said, just what I did, campuses can't be deliberately indifferent, and she gave a list of things that campus can do. And the first thing that she mentioned was that campus officials can speak up and condemn the expression of anti-Semitism. As I said to the prior question, that's not sufficient, but silence is a very powerful message. Now I can come directly to your question. The University of Chicago adopted something called the Calvin Report, where it said, we're not going to take positions on issues. And a lot of college and university presidents last fall embraced the Calvin Report and said, well, we're not going to say anything. We're going to be silent. I am very critical of that for just the reason I said, silence is a message in itself. And there's times when college universities have to speak up. When there are expressions of anti-Semitism, or for that matter, Islamophobia, or racism, or homophobia, campus officials need to speak up and condemn it, because their silence is a message. Obviously, campus officials need to think about when they're going to speak up, but as an example, after the tragic death of George Floyd, I found it essential as a dean of a law school to send a message to my community and to articulate the pain that I knew that many were feeling and to provide support. After January 6th, I felt as a dean of a law school the need to send a message about the rule of law. And so I very much reject the idea that campus officials should be silent because their silence is so often the wrong message. I know I didn't get to all of the parts of your question, but I hope that got to the essence of the question. If they say nothing and they do nothing, that's deliberate indifference. That's what violates Title VI. For Congress to pull funding, now you get into the phrase that you use, the unconstitutional condition doctrine. And in plain English, all that means is the government can't condition a benefit on giving up a constitutional right. The government can't say, you get welfare only in exchange for you can't criticize the president or the governor. If Congress pulls funding for behavior that's not protected by the Constitution, no problem. But Congress can't pull funding for university officials exercising their First Amendment rights. That would be an unconstitutional condition.
Thank you, Dean. I have 3 children at different schools, Denison, Duke, and Harvard, so kind of the gamut. And I'm not a lawyer, but I just have a free speech question that's challenging. There is no free speech at these colleges, specifically around black issues and trans issues. And for many of us, that's been a good thing. It's helped to move things in a good way. But how do I explain to my children that there needs to be free speech around Israel, or around Palestine, around Zionism, around Judaism, when it's clearly not being applied to other hot-button issues?
I want to draw a distinction between the university regulating speech and social pressures that might stop expression from happening. They're very different. With regard to a university regulating speech, all 3 universities you mentioned are private universities. They don't have to comply with the First Amendment. In fact, just recently there was a suit against Harvard University for being deliberately indifferent to anti-Semitism, and Harvard tried to raise the First Amendment. And the judge actually said, you don't get a First Amendment defense. You're a private university. So Harvard and Duke and Denison all have much more latitude than Berkeley or UCLA would have. So to start there. But I think that your question is much more about the social pressure that exists among students not to express certain things. And I think that's right. And there's always been social pressure. But I think what keeps there from being certain things expressed by students about race or about trans issues is social pressure among themselves. No?
No. Social pressure. The school is absolute. The schools are absolute in not tolerating a gamut of opinions. And I want to emphasize, in many ways, I think for this room, that's achieved things that we like. But now our children are in an environment where we're being told, you have to have a variety of opinions. You have to have uncomfortable conversations. And as Reformed Jews, that's a very appealing argument, but it doesn't feel like we're going back and covering everything. It feels like these and frankly, the Palestinian issue is cast as a black issue, which doesn't even make a lot of sense to many of us who are laymen. And it is not just social construct, in my opinion. It really is how the colleges are operating.
You're asking about cancel culture, Alan?
But it's more than what you're saying is that universities are imposing restrictions on speech that doesn't follow an orthodoxy with regard to race or with regard to trans issues. And I think we need to, we don't have time now, be really interested in what university things you're referring to that the universities are doing. But I will say that I completely agree with you, and I said this earlier, that universities are not treating expression of anti-Semitism in the same way that they're treating expressions of racism. The last thing that you say, I do want to focus on, and I'm going to say something here that's uncomfortable to say and uncomfortable to hear. The Students for Justice in Palestine nationally have been very effective the last several years in presenting their cause as about representing Palestinians who are oppressed people of color and building coalitions with other affinity groups of students of color. And Jews are then portrayed as white, and it is very much about the oppressor and the oppressed. And I think one of the things that campus officials need to do, we all need to think about is how can we build effective coalitions again with other groups? So when we're talking about the Black Law Student Association in a law school, that they will build a relationship with the Jewish law students. It's not just the black law students coming out so strongly for students in just in Palestine. But this phenomena is one that if you talk to educators, we're seeing all across the country.
With respect to the right to protest at a California public university, is there a difference between a protester who is a student and a protester who is not a student or faculty member of the university?
Well, there's certainly a difference in terms of the ability of the university to impose discipline. The university can discipline a student or a faculty member. The university can't discipline the outsider. That person could be criminally prosecuted, but there's no university authority over that person in the same way. The answer to your question is, has the campus been opened to outsiders? And most campuses have public areas where outsiders can be there, and then the outsider can engage in a protest. We have parts of our building that are accessible only to law faculty, staff, and students, and then an outsider is trespassing. So the answer to your question will depend very much on the place at the university and the rules that exist for that place as to whether outsiders are welcome to be there or whether they're trespassers, if I'm answering your question.
So I've been thinking a lot since I went to college and to law school about this idea of free speech and the ability to disagree and have a conversation, but also the ability to take in somebody else's point of view and cancel culture and this whole conversation with DEI and what you're being taught in school. And I guess what I want to know is, first a comment, I suppose. I feel like a lot of universities have taken a perspective, which again, a lot of us in this room agree with, of promoting values of inclusion and diversity and equity, which are positive in a lot of ways, but the negative of it is that they are imposing a frame of reference and a way of thinking on people in such a way that is didactic and not analytic. And I'm concerned, I guess, and I want to know your opinion as far as the University of California, Berkeley Law School is concerned, as to what you're teaching students, because what I'm concerned about is that students aren't being taught how to think, and they're not being taught to get to that positive place of DEI in a natural way, in a way that like you use your own intellect and values to get to that place. They're just being told what to believe. And it's really, and I think that the fact that they're being told what to believe is leading to a situation where people are categorizing groups just based on their identity. And I think that that's really the crux of the problem, is that students are not learning anymore. They're learning what to think, not how to think. And I'd be curious to know what you, as dean of the law school, are doing to combat that.
I think students are being taught how to think. If there's anything that I think law school does is teach analytical thinking. So I do believe that. I teach every semester. I try very hard in my class to make sure that both sides get presented, and if there's not students to articulate one side, I'll articulate that side. I say to students, I said it a week ago at orientation, that it's so important they hear all sides, nothing else to prepare them for being ready for the arguments they'll hear as lawyers. And I think students should question everything. One of the first messages I give to students in a constitutional law class is, just because the Supreme Court says it doesn't mean it's right. You have to think and decide for yourself. Now, with regard to DEI, the school takes a position with regard to this. I think the school should take a position with regard to this. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are values that we believe in. And I hope that everyone in this room at that level of abstraction would agree. We all benefit from being in a diverse educational environment. We all want equity in how people are treated. We want everybody to feel like they belong. At that level of abstraction, there's nothing at all objectionable about it. And yes, the institution stands for those values. But then when you start talking about what does it mean, when I'm teaching First Amendment this semester, we're going to have should universities require diversity statements for faculty candidates? We'll have a debate about that. But institutions have to stand for values. And one of those values is the importance of freedom of speech. And that doesn't mean students can't question it, but the institution still has to stand up for the values it believes in. And for me, those include diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think I just disagree with your premise, because I think we do teach students to think. Not as well as we should, not as well as we could, but I still think that's what law schools are fundamentally doing.
I have a friend who makes a distinction between DEI as the concepts like you're talking about and the DEI movement. And I think some questions that you're getting are around the connection to what we're seeing on campuses and the DEI movement. I wonder if you think there is a connection or not at all.
I'll go to the distinction that I drew. If we say at an abstract level, should we as an institution want to be diverse? Should we care about treating people equitably? Should we care about being inclusive and belonging? I think it's unobjectionable. We have to stand for those values. And of course, students can reject those values, but I see nothing wrong with us as an institution stand for it. Now, how we implement those values can very much be a subject of debate, and we can talk about, should there be racial preferences? Should there be DEI statements that are given? I'm very critical of many things that our Office of Faculty Equity and Inclusion, whatever they're called, does in the name of DEI. But I think that's the distinction I draw between the general commitment and then arguing over the specifics.
We'll take a couple more questions, then we'll start to wrap up.
First of all, thank you so much for coming here. I really want to acknowledge what happened in April in your house, and it really pained me. And thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
I had, at the University of California, and at all universities, but especially the University of California, there's different levels of speech. There are people that are out on the lawns and whatnot yelling. Then there are classroom settings, and then there are websites. And I'm wondering the distinction of people putting messages, anti-Zionist, which to me is anti-Semitic, on websites like at UC Santa Cruz and UC Berkeley, and probably some of the other universities, a medical school class that was taped where the lecturer had people chanting things versus, for faculty and students.
I have a strong position here. It is not the position of the University of California. My position is that schools and departments, as schools and departments, should not be taking positions. Faculty members, as individuals or collectively, can say anything they want. The faculty, individually, collectively, students individually, collectively, have free speech rights. But the school and the department are part of the University of California. So when the ethnic studies departments of the University of California posted very blatantly anti-Israel messages, I felt that that's not for this department to take. The law school doesn't take positions, whether we agree or disagree with the Supreme Court's decisions overruling Roe versus Wade or affirmative action. I would never think of the law school as a faculty saying, we should take an institutional position. Faculty can sign petitions, all of them can sign it, but that's the distinction that I would draw. Just recently, the Regents of the University of California adopted a position saying that the landing page for a website should not be taking positions. And I think what they're trying to do is go in that direction, but of course, since it can link to subordinate websites, I'm not sure it gets where they want to go. But my position was not one that persuaded my campus or the Regents.
Dean, thank you very much again for coming. I'm Alex. As my mother in Israel will tell you, she's very disappointed. I didn't go to law school, so I did my best.
There's still time.
And, she just told me that. I'm not kidding. I
think my mother's disappointed I didn't go to medical school. Or didn't become a rabbi.
So I think following your introduction was great, by the way, the 4 points that you made. Where I get a little bit lost around Title VI is this. The protection of Jews versus the protection of Zionists. I happen to be both, but I am not perfectly comfortable saying right here, no, one and the same, impossible to divorce. A Jew is, at least many people consider, a religion, and as such, like a Muslim or a Christian. But a Zionist embraces a position on things. So can you explain in Title VI, if I am somebody who very overtly embraces a specific position, is that also protected, or is it identity only?
The First Amendment protects the right to express any positions. Title VI actually is about race and national origin, but the Supreme Court has interpreted it to include protection of Jews and Muslims. I'm not going to, and I defer to the rabbi here, to try to talk about to what extent is being a Jew religious, or to what extent is it cultural, or is it both? And I'm going to use your question to make a more general point, and then try to get to your specific question briefly. I think far too much time has been spent over the last year trying to define what is anti-Semitism, and to what extent is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism. And I think what that ends up obscuring is even the most blatantly anti-Semitic things then aren't focused on, because we're spending so much time talking about what's the right definition of anti-Semitism. I've seen so many opinion polls, and they're remarkably the same. About 88% of Jews in the United States believe that there should be self-determination and the existence of Israel. And one of the interesting things that's happened over the last year or two is those who want to express clearly anti-Semitic things phrase it as anti-Zionism now. So David Duke, the white racist in the South, doesn't speak about Jews, he speaks about Zionism. And Zionism has really become this four-letter word. And what we have to do is find a way of defending the concept. And so to me, when people are saying things that are clearly anti-Semitic, it doesn't matter if they use the word Zion rather than anti-Semitic. When they put up the poster about me that said, boycott Zionist Chem, with caricature of me holding a bloody knife and pouring blood on my lips, that was the same as saying, boycott the Jewish Dean.
Thank you so much for being here. All week long, I have had this question in my head, but I don't necessarily know how to frame it. But earlier this week, the House on Education and Workforce found that over 80 students arrested at Columbia will be returning to campus this fall. Over 20 of them were those that broke into Hamilton Hall, vandalized the building, so on and so forth. What perceptions does a school like Columbia especially, but any of these schools, give off in terms of their enforcement of rules? And obviously, personally, I have many friends that attend Columbia. They are Jewish, and they are completely scared out of their mind to have these persons back on campus. But, what perceptions would you say, at least what legal frameworks are there that, what can we do, or what can happen? I mean, how can they allow these, people that were arrested to come back? I mean, I'm just so lost, and I know that my question is so not constructed, but
I think your question implies its own answer, that campuses need to hold responsible and accountable those who violate the law and campus rules. And if campuses do nothing, that in itself sends a message. And then we get to talk about, why did Columbia respond this way? Why didn't it expel the students who did that? And we can try to come up with theories with regard to it. So I think your question very much tells us the answer, is that if campuses don't take anti-Semitism seriously, it's a message, and unfortunately it's a message that's then felt by Jewish students quite acutely.
I know there are a few more questions. Maybe Dean Chemerinsky will stick around for some personal questions. I'm going to ask the final question in this format, which is, in the midst of this polarization and this incredibly challenging environment we're in, and potentially, as I have not read your book yet, but I heard you talk a little bit about it, potentially coming to the end of the Constitution's time for defining what America should be. Maybe we're ready for a new Constitution, as I heard you say. Given all of that, what's inspiring about the work you're doing? Where can we find a little optimism?
I think we find optimism from history. I asked Justice Sotomayor exactly that question as the last one in our exchange at the end of January. And the answer that she gave is the same answer that I gave before and since. And it's the answer that I say to my students always on the last day of constitutional law. If you look at the overall sweep of American and world history, there's been a tremendous expansion in equality and freedom. I mean, there's a huge way for our country to go with regard to racial equality. But think about what it was in 1787, or I was born in 1953. At that point, there was still Jim Crow laws segregating every aspect of the South. You can think about it in terms of sexual orientation. After all, it's only 9 years ago that the Supreme Court said that gays and lesbians are entitled to equal dignity and the right to marry. With regard to freedom of speech, the Supreme Court, about the first 130 years of American history, never enforced the First Amendment. There weren't First Amendment cases. We have a much more robust sense, much greater protection of freedom of speech now than we used to. That doesn't deny the problems. It doesn't deny that we're, in so many ways, facing crises. But I think that the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. got it right when he said, the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. What I tell my students is, but it will only be that if they work to make it happen. And so what gives me hope is my students. And I teach both law students and undergraduates in their optimism, in their values. And yes, there are problems on campus, but the commitment of the students to try to create a more perfect world, to fix the broken world, really is what inspires me.
Well, I think we're all inspired to know that you're leading them and continue to do so with such grace and wisdom and humility. Thank you so very much, Dean Chemerinsky. Beautiful, beautiful night. Thank you. Most appreciated. I hope you'll consider coming back sometime.